Okay, so today we're going to be diving into a topic that's pretty heavy, but really important. We're talking about the Atlantic slave trade.
Right. Yeah.
And, I think a lot of people, when they hear that phrase, they think about, people ripped from their homes and
Oh,
families
yeah.
and sold across an ocean. And it's true, like, that's a huge part of the story.
hmm
But this wasn't just like a one-time tragedy or a handful of isolated incidents.
No.
This was a system, a brutal system
Yeah.
that operated for centuries.
You're absolutely right. And it's a system that honestly um, continues to shape our world, like in really profound ways.
Absolutely.
We've got some excerpts here from the Wikipedia article on the Atlantic slave trade, which can be, kind of dense.
Yeah, a little bit.
But we're going to break it down.
Yeah.
We're going to extract like the most important information
Right.
so you can really grasp the scale of this trade, who was involved, and the impact it still has today.
Yeah, because sometimes Wikipedia is like drinking from a fire hose.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
There's just so much information.
Yeah.
So to kind of set the stage a little bit,
Right.
before the transatlantic slave trade even began, slavery already existed in Africa.
Right.
But it wasn't the same type of slavery
Right.
that was imposed later on.
Right. Yeah. That's an important distinction to make. In a lot of African societies, slavery was actually closer to what we might call indentured servitude.
Okay.
It wasn't based on race.
Okay.
And enslaved people could have some rights, even the possibility of earning their freedom.
So how did things shift? Like, how did it get to this point?
Well, you've got to think about what was happening in Europe at the time. European powers were building empires and their colonies, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the Americas, they desperately needed labor for all these lucrative cash crops, sugar, tobacco,
Oh, right.
things like that. So this demand created this horrific opportunity for profit. And Europeans, they saw a chance to kind of exploit these existing systems of servitude in Africa and twist them into something far more brutal and dehumanizing.
So it wasn't just like a case of Europeans arriving and forcing a completely new system onto the continent?
Not exactly. It was more insidious than that. They kind of, they manipulated existing power structures. They amplified them
Right.
to serve their own economic interests.
Right.
It's really a story of collaboration,
Right.
as much as it is a story of exploitation.
Absolutely, which I think really becomes evident when you look at the sheer scale of this trade.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about an estimated 12.5 million Africans shipped across the Atlantic over roughly 4 centuries. To put that into perspective, that's more than the entire population of many countries today.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that these numbers are constantly being refined by historians, as new research comes out.
Right.
And plus, this was just one part of a much larger global slave trade.
Right.
For example, the Arab slave trade. That spanned like 12 centuries
Wow.
and is estimated to have involved 11.5 to 14 million Africans.
Yeah. It's just hard to even comprehend numbers that large.
Yeah.
So this all took place, mainly within a system that we know as the triangle trade, right?
Precisely. Imagine this, like three-legged system, where European goods were traded to Africa. Enslaved Africans were then shipped to the Americas.
Right.
And finally, American products, which were often produced through slave labor, were sent back to Europe. So it's this like triangular flow.
Right. So it really highlights how interconnected the world already was, even way back then.
Exactly. And it's like a stark illustration of how global interconnectedness can be used for both progress and, terrible exploitation.
Yeah.
For example, the source actually mentions that textiles from India played a key role in this trade network, just highlighting how far-reaching the impact truly was.
Now let's unpack, kind of, a complex and honestly uncomfortable aspect of this. The participation and the resistance. It's a difficult thing to face, but we can't ignore that this trade involved collaboration.
Right.
Some African kingdoms and traders participated in capturing and selling people to Europeans.
Yeah, and they often did this in exchange for goods like muskets, textiles, alcohol.
Yeah.
It's a challenging aspect of this history to grapple with. But I think it's crucial to understand the context.
Yeah.
Many African societies were already engaged in warfare.
Right.
They had existing systems of slavery, even if they were different.
Right.
Europeans exploited those existing divisions and power dynamics for their own gain.
For sure. But at the same time, resistance existed.
Oh, absolutely.
At every stage, right?
At every stage, from individual acts of defiance to, like, organized uprisings. Africans constantly fought back against this system. I mean, we see incredible examples like Queen Binziga of Ndongo in the 17th century. She fiercely resisted Portuguese slave raids.
And there were countless revolts aboard slave ships
Yeah.
and communities that helped escape slaves, you know? It's just a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of such horrific oppression.
These acts of resistance, while often overshadowed by the brutality of the trade, they're absolutely critical to our understanding.
Yeah.
They shatter this misconception of Africans as like passive victims.
Right.
And instead, they highlight this constant presence of agency and resistance,
Yeah.
even in the most dire circumstances.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, those acts of resistance are all the more remarkable when we consider what awaited those who were captured and transported across the Atlantic.
Right, right.
I mean, life on the plantations, it was brutal.
Yeah. The sources paint a truly horrific picture of the conditions enslaved Africans faced in the Americas. It wasn't just, the backbreaking labor, the physical abuse.
No.
It was the systematic dehumanization.
Exactly. Enslaved people were denied basic human rights.
Yeah.
The kinds of things we often take for granted, like the right to marry freely, to raise their own children.
Right.
It's all about control, breaking their spirits,
Hmm.
preventing them from forming strong families, strong communities.
The source mentions this particularly chilling legal principle called partus sequitur ventrum, which basically means that which is brought forth follows the womb.
Right. And what that meant in practice was that the legal status of a child was determined by the status of the mother. So a child born to an enslaved woman was automatically considered a slave.
Regardless of who the father was.
Yeah, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
It was a way to create a permanent underclass.
Of laborers, right?
A system designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many.
It's almost impossible to grasp, the sheer scale of the suffering. And it's easy to forget that the horrors didn't just begin with the Middle Passage.
You're right.
With that journey across the Atlantic.
It's true. The source actually points out that an estimated 50% of deaths related to the slave trade may have occurred in Africa itself.
Really?
Through warfare, through capture, and those brutal forced marches.
It's a stark reminder of the full human cost of this trade, not just in terms of, lives lost, but also the generational trauma that was inflicted on individuals, on families, on entire communities.
And the long-term demographic impacts on the African continent are still debated by scholars today. There are different interpretations of how the slave trade affected population growth, economic development, even, cultural practices. It's a very complex issue with no easy answers.
This deep dive is really highlighting the fact that there's so much more to this history than just simple facts and figures, right?
Yeah.
There are so many layers,
That's
so many perspectives to consider.
And that's why engaging with diverse sources and viewpoints is so crucial. I mean, there's always more to learn. And those different perspectives, they enrich our understanding.
For sure. So let's kind of shift our focus now to the movement to abolish the slave trade.
Okay.
And the lasting legacy that this period has left behind. I mean, the fight to end this horrific system was a long and challenging one, wasn't it?
It was. It was a fight led by both, black and white abolitionists who risked their lives, their reputations to expose the horrors of the slave trade and advocate for its end. Figures like William Wilberforce in Britain come to mind.
Right.
But there were countless others who dedicated themselves to this cause.
And of course, we can't forget the powerful impact of slave uprisings.
Yes.
Particularly the Haitian Revolution.
The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves
Yeah.
through the Americas and Europe.
Right.
Here you had this successful slave revolt that resulted in the establishment of an independent Black republic. I mean, it challenged the very foundations of the slave system, and it terrified those who profited from it.
But the end of the slave trade wasn't solely driven by moral arguments.
Right.
There were also, shifts in economic conditions and, frankly, fear.
You're exactly right. As European nations entered the Industrial Revolution,
Okay.
some began to see the economic limitations of slavery.
Right.
A free labor force
Okay.
was seen as more efficient, more adaptable to the demands of industrial production.
Yeah.
And the fear of further slave revolts.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Inspired by the success in Haiti, also made some elites question the long-term viability of the system.
Right. So even though the transatlantic slave trade was officially abolished, its legacy, it continues to cast a long shadow.
It does.
The deep inequalities that persist in both Africa and the Americas, They're a direct result of this horrific chapter in human history.
The legacy is multifaceted. It's
Mm,
pervasive.
yeah.
It's a legacy of racism, of economic exploitation, of systemic oppression that continues to shape our world
Right.
in ways both visible and invisible. I think understanding this legacy is absolutely crucial to addressing the ongoing issues of racial and social justice that we face today.
It's a lot to process, honestly. Like, where do we even go from here? It feels like we've only just, like, scratched the surface,
Yeah,
you
but
know?
that's true. But I think recognizing that is already a step forward.
Right.
And I think what's crucial to understand is that this isn't just about the past.
Mm.
The legacy of the slave trade, it's woven into the fabric of our present.
Hmm.
We see it in the ongoing racial disparities, the economic inequalities, the social injustices that we're still dealing with.
Yeah, and it can feel so overwhelming. Like, it makes you wonder, what can we even do with this knowledge?
That's the question, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, the sources touch upon some efforts to apologize for the slave trade, but is an apology truly enough? Like, what would real accountability even look like?
Right.
How do we even begin to address the immensity of the harm?
It feels like it would take a monumental effort to even begin to make things right.
It certainly would. There are no easy answers here, no quick fixes. It requires a sustained commitment to understanding the past, acknowledging the present, and actively working towards a more just future. It means dismantling those systems of inequality that are rooted in this trade and combating racism in all its forms.
So, in a way, this deep dive, it's been just the beginning of a much larger journey of learning and action.
Exactly. And I encourage you to continue exploring this topic, read more,
Yeah.
listen to different perspectives, engage in those difficult conversations that we often try to avoid.
Yeah, for sure.
It's only by confronting this history head on that we can even begin to heal and create a world that truly values justice and equality for all.
It's clear that the sources we've examined today offer just a glimpse into the vastness and the complexity of the Atlantic slave trade, but they also serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of continuing to learn, to question, and most importantly, to act.
Here's a final thought to leave you with. The transatlantic slave trade was a global system of exploitation. And it's not enough to just simply condemn it. We each need to ask ourselves, how are we still connected to this system today? In what ways do we, perhaps unknowingly, benefit from or even perpetuate the inequalities that are rooted in this history?
Yeah,
It's something I encourage you to reflect on as you move forward.
that's a really powerful point. It drives home the fact that this history isn't just something that happened in the past, it's something that we have a responsibility to grapple with in the present. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been truly eye-opening.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, knowledge is most powerful when it's shared and used to create positive change. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking understanding. And never stop pushing for a more just and equitable world.